Hello Internet, my name is Eder, and welcome to another episode of Film Editorials. In my past two videos, I've discussed movies where teams of superheroes that normally fight with each other were fighting against each other. In this week's video, I'm discussing a movie where a team of superheroes who normally fights together are fighting with each other. That's right, the topic of today's video is X-Men Apocalypse. X-Men Apocalypse picks up 10 years after the events of Days of Future Past. That is, the past part of Days of Future Past, the stuff in the 70s. This movie's set in the 80s, and it's a fictional version of the 80s where A, mutants exist, and B, those mutants have largely been accepted into society despite Magneto's attempts to kill the president and stuff in Days of Future Past. Professor Xavier has set up his school for mutant children, and things are going pretty well until Apocalypse, who is the world's first mutant, is awakened in Egypt, and things just go sideways from there, as you might expect from a guy whose name is Apocalypse. Bryan Singer is once again at the helm of this X-Men movie. He also directed the first two X-Men movies back in the early 2000s, and he also directed Days of Future Past. Also returning to this X-Men movie are James McAvoy as Professor Xavier, Michael Fassbender as Magneto, and Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique. There's a bunch of other people in this movie up to the point where there's, I think, like 12 mutants on screen at the same time. It's a lot of people. My big problem with this movie, and I have to bring it up first because it kind of colors everything I'm going to say later on, but my big problem is that I feel like I've seen a lot of this movie before. That sentiment manifests itself very directly with things like whole lines taken out of other X-Men movies and put into this one, recycled elements, if you will. And also a lot of the character arcs are very similar, like something bad happens to Magneto, Magneto gets angry, Magneto tries to destroy the world. We've seen this before. Cyclops and Jean Grey and Quicksilver and Nightcrawler and Angel and Storm are all in this movie, and yeah, it's their origin stories for the most part, but we've seen these characters before, and they're not doing anything different than they were the last time we saw them, which kind of makes sense because of the time travel elements of Days of Future Past. But I've seen these characters before going through the same arcs that they're going through now, and it's very familiar. So even though the cast is really strong and they can do good performances, I still feel like these performances are old and tired because I've seen them before. Fassbender brings a lot of emotion to Magneto, and then he has that just under the surface rage that was so good in First Class. It's here on display again, but it just feels like they're repeating themselves. It doesn't feel like they're adding anything new. It doesn't feel like a new element of Magneto's character. It's just, hey, remember what you liked about that other movie? We can do it too. And like the other two superhero movies I've reviewed recently, this movie has a very large ensemble cast, and this is kind of a midway point between the two styles of movies. The Batman vs. Superman ensemble, which is huge and diverse, but mostly pointless and just kind of thrown in at the end. And then there's Captain America Civil War, where everybody has something to do and largely very clear motivations. This movie has everybody doing something, so they're all active participants, but they're not terribly well-defined participants. So Angel's motivations are threadbare, and that's being kind of polite. Psylocke is important to the final fight, Storm is important to the final fight, but you don't get a whole lot of insight into why they pick the side they pick, and why they then decide to change, if they decide to change allegiances later on. And while we're on the topic of the final fight, I thought the action was pretty good. I was enjoying myself during the fight scenes and the explosion scenes. But to circle back around to the things feel recycled elements of it, there's a scene where Quicksilver really gets to show off his powers. Again, very much like Days of Future Past. In Days of Future Past, he does speeding around the lobby of the Pentagon scene, which was awesome and surprising and hilarious and great. And in this movie, he does the same thing in Xavier's mansion, saving people. It's not a bad scene, but it doesn't work as well as it did the first time, partially because it's very clear that it's coming, and then you're just watching very similar elements happen again. And it's kind of a disappointment. Another aspect of the Quicksilver scene in this movie that I didn't like so much was the music. In the last Quicksilver show-off scene, it really made sense. He had the Walkman with him where he was listening to the music, and then we heard the music with him as he went around. So that worked. There was an explanation for it. In this movie, it's just a pop song from the 80s that you're going to recognize, and it's just non-diegetic, it's played over top of everything, and it doesn't really seem to fit with what he's doing at the time either. And unfortunately for the scene in X-Men Apocalypse, this musical misstep comes after what I feel is another musical misstep, where they use classical music that you've definitely heard before in a big climactic scene where something big and important is going on. And I had to spend a lot of time thinking about where I had heard this instead of focusing on what was going on in the movie. And I don't know why they would use a piece of music that's iconic in the public domain in this movie when it's Apocalypse showing off. Why would you do that? You have a guy writing the score for your movie, why can't he write a score for this scene where Apocalypse does something really cool? Put in like Apocalypse theme, it would go right there. But instead, we get classical music that we've probably all heard before. Circling back around to some compliments, I did like the humor in this movie. There's one joke in particular that I enjoyed a lot because it contains a Star Wars reference and it works on 2 other levels because it's making fun of the 3rd movie in a series. And since X-Men Apocalypse is the 3rd movie in this new X-Men series, and Singer is also making fun of X3, which he didn't direct. It wouldn't be one of my video reviews if I didn't talk about the villain in this superhero movie, and Apocalypse is not my favorite villain we've ever seen. I like Oscar Isaac and I think he does a pretty good job with what he's been given, but since the writers of the comic books haven't really decided what his powers are going to be in the comic books, it makes it very difficult for the writers of the movie, I feel, to narrow in on some powers. So his powers are very poorly defined and kind of confusing, and you just kind of gotta know that he's like really powerful and stuff. And then of course it's Oscar Isaac wearing a bunch of purple makeup and prosthetics, and so you kind of get the feeling that he really has to act his way through the mask he has on, basically. And that's unfortunate, because there's a couple close-ups where you're like, that's not the best makeup work I've ever seen. Now, I've spent a lot of time in this video talking about how this movie compares and fits in with the other X-Men movies, so I think it's important to mention that if you haven't seen any of the other X-Men movies, this movie is going to be basically total gibberish to you. If you've seen X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Future Past, this movie should make sense to you, and you're probably actually going to enjoy it more than I did, because I remember X-Men X2, X-Men United, and X3, The Last Stand, pretty well, and there are many elements of those 3 films that are being borrowed and repurposed and recycled again, and that's what was holding me back. So this movie really panders to people who understand, read, know the comics. I am not one of those people, so for the last like 2 minutes, and I'm including the post-credit scene in this, I kind of recognized some stuff, but otherwise I didn't have very strong reaction to these things because I don't know what they're talking about. And in the post-credit sequence, there's a name that gets thrown out, and I assume that's important because we spend a good percentage of the time looking at this name, but it means absolutely nothing to me. Comic book fans will probably be really excited about it, but I don't know what it means. Okay, so I'm gonna have to give X-Men Apocalypse 2.5 stars out of 5. Generally speaking, it's pretty enjoyable, the humor is there, the action is pretty good, the characters all have something to do, but on the negative side, it does feel very familiar because of all the recycled elements. There were a number of musical missteps, I feel, and because the cast is so large, not all the characters get an opportunity to shine, or even really to be understood fully. It's enjoyable enough as a movie. If I see this movie again, it's probably gonna be when I'm at home, doing something else like playing a video game or folding my laundry or something else so I don't have to pay 100% attention, because if I think too hard about this movie, I'll probably just find other things I didn't like about it and other things that didn't really make sense. Okay, that's gonna be it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, favorite, share this video with your friends, subscribe to my channel here on YouTube, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat. Speaking of the apocalypse, if you watch the 24-hour news cycle, you might feel like the world's about to end at any second, but I know something that might help with that feeling. The Good News Review, tgnreview.com, is a place where you can find substantive, positive news stories, and other things that will brighten your day by actually seeing good news in the world instead of just the fire and brimstone that you're used to seeing on things like CNN. If that kind of thing interests you, check out the Good News Review, tgnreview.com, or download their app, which is now available in the Apple App Store. Okay, I will see you guys next time. Bye!